And it looks like most folks have already joined us. Just to let you know, we are recording this. We are excited to share with you the Pennsylvania Environmental Scorecard. Did your legislator make the grade? We will get started here in just a moment to give folks just another minute to join in before we get started with all of our panelists. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, or you can put it in the chat as well. We do have people monitoring both. All right, I am going to kick it over to Michelle to get us started before we head into some of our partners.
Thank you, Katie. Well, thank you everyone for attending today, and welcome to our 2022 scorecard launch. We're really excited to have everyone here today. What a great turnout. You're going to be hearing from different members of the Sierra Club, conservation voters of PA, the Clean Water Action and Clean Air Action Fund. And we've been working since 2021 started and the legislative session began to look at different bills and be able to compile this scorecard. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, Jen Quinn. She's the Legislative and Political Director for Sierra Club, the Pennsylvania chapter. Jen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for the release of our 2021-2022 environmental scorecard. The groups here tonight track and score the most important environmental bills during each two-year legislative session and compile this scorecard. With just a quick glance, anyone can see descriptions of the bills, how all 203 members of the General Assembly voted on each bill. That's every state rep and every state senator. And you can easily see their score for this legislative session, as well as a lifetime score since 2007. Now, we think the environment should be a priority. And this document quickly and easily allows every Pennsylvanian to see whether or not their state level elected officials prioritize the environment and public health, or whether they prioritize corporations and extractive industries. We believe engaged and informed citizens are critical to our democracy. Every resident can and should hold their elected officials accountable. And this scorecard makes that a little easier. I can't stress this enough. Accountability matters. Letting those in power know that their constituents are watching is very important. If you have a state rep or a state senator with a high score, call their office, send them an email, thank them. And if you have an elected official who doesn't seem to care about clean water, clean air, or the public health, call them, schedule a meeting, share your concerns, and vote for candidates that care about the issues that matter to you. Now, we understand that the average person probably doesn't have the time to track or analyze bills, and that's why we do this, so we can share this important information with everyone. And when we see so many egregious bills every legislative session, it becomes very clear why this information matters. One of those very egregious bills is here on one of those slides, House Bill 2644. Now, before I get to the bill, let me give you a little background information. Pennsylvania has an abandoned oil and gas well problem, a big problem, like so big of a problem that no one really knows how many abandoned wells are out there, but estimates show hundreds of thousands of wells, all leaking methane, and the cost to cap those wells is billions of dollars. And those billions are expected to come from the state, or in other words, from taxpayers, from you and me. So why do we have this problem? One reason is that some wells were drilled prior to regulations requiring that the well be properly capped and decommissioned. Another reason, since regulations were established, is that there are instances where oil and gas companies file for bankruptcy, they move out of the state, and they just abandon the wells. There are supposed to be financial assurances in place to prevent this sort of abandonment. This is known as bonding. It's kind of like a security deposit when you move into an apartment, putting up a certain amount of money in advance and ensuring there's money available to address any damages when you move out. It's kind of the same here. When the well is done producing, the company must properly cap and decommission the well. If they do that, they get their bond back. If they don't do that, the bond is there to provide the state the needed funds to cap the well. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, the current bonding amount for a conventional oil and gas well is only $2,500. This bond amount is so low, oil and gas companies don't care if they lose this deposit, and this small amount doesn't even come close to covering the cost of actually plugging the well, which DEP estimates to be around $33,000. If everything goes smoothly, it can be exponentially higher if they run into problems. And this bill, HB 2644, locks in that terribly inadequate bonding amount for a decade, ensuring more wells are abandoned and more financial responsibility is passed on to the state and the taxpayers. This bill was passed by both chambers and became law. Another troubling issue we've seen the past few years is preemption. Preemption is the use of state law to nullify a local law or local authority. We saw this previously with plastic bag bans, gun control, minimum wage, where a local government will try to do something and the state legislature says, nope, you can't do this. This session, it was Senate Bill 275 and House Bill 1947. These bills would strip local authority and prevent local governments from restricting natural gas hookups in new construction, making it much harder for municipalities to meet their decarbonization and climate goals. I think at this point, we can all agree that we can't keep building and investing in new gas infrastructure if we want to meet our decarbonization goals by 2050. Now, this bill is actually a response to a number of California cities enacting gas bans, but there are no municipalities that we're aware of that are even considering enacting a gas ban for new construction in Pennsylvania. These bills were developed by the American Gas Association, a trade organization representing energy companies that deliver natural gas. And they've been very busy getting similar language introduced in at least 24 other states. Senate Bill 275 was passed by the legislature and thankfully vetoed by the governor, but is a clear representation of how influential and powerful the gas industry is in Pennsylvania. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for such a wonderful explanation and for introducing the scorecard to everyone so well. And just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A forum. Next, we'll be hearing from Steve. He is the Pennsylvania Campaigns Director for Clean Water Action. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Michelle. Good evening, everybody. As Michelle said, my name is Steve Hosdovich. I'm the Pennsylvania Campaigns Director for Clean Water Action. For any of the participants tonight who aren't familiar with us, we're an 80,000 member strong organization within the Commonwealth. We're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year of bringing issue expertise, solution-oriented thinking, and people power to the table in order to make further advancements to protect our environment, health, economic well-being, and community quality of life, as well as environmental injustices. The first part I'm going to talk about today as it relates to our scorecard actually talks about the real Jekyll and Hyde scenario that was happening in terms of the dynamic within the legislature this session. On the good side of things, aka the Jekyll side of things, we saw a lot of average scores rise in both the House and in the Senate from the previous session. So for example, if you take a look, whenever you actually get a chance to take a look at the scorecard, you'll notice that in 2019 and 2020, the overall average environmental score was 40%. That went up to 43%. Democratic scores amongst House legislators rose from 83% to 91%. Even average score, environmental scores amongst Republicans rose from 3% to 4%. First-term Democrats had an average score that rose from 92% last session to 96% in this session. First-term Republican legislators, their score rose. It was 4% last session, 6% this session. And we had an increase in overall champions, which we are classifying as those legislators scoring 100%. So in the House last session, we had 30 of those. This time we doubled that to 61. The same situation is happening in the Senate. Everything is on the rise. 38% overall last session, up to 45%. Democratic average scores rose from 84% to 91%. Republican scores rose from 3% to 12%. First-term Republican scores rose from 7% to 14%. First term Democratic scores stayed flat at 94%, but still a strong showing. And we also had an increase in environmental champions from 8 in 2019-2020 to 12 in 21-22. And so we think that when we see this type of stuff, it actually yields what can potentially happen when you have bipartisan action and rises in environmental scores. And I think one indication of that you'll see scored within our scorecard is SB 522 or Senate Bill 522, which unanimously passed in the state Senate this session. And this is a bill that addresses a gap that, according to the PA Department of Health, has left 68% of children in Pennsylvania under the age of 2 without getting tested for lead. This despite knowing exposure can cause developmental disorders, including lowered IQs and violent behavior, and that all children across Pennsylvania, but especially Black and Hispanic children, remain at risk due to lead paint in old housing, aging infrastructure leaking lead into our drinking water, and soil contamination from demolished industrial sites. It's why universal blood lead level testing, which is what this legislation does, has been endorsed by State Senate Task Force on Lead Exposure, Governor Wolf, and leading medical professionals across the Commonwealth. This is, in fact, the closest we've come in 5 years to adopting and implementing a comprehensive statewide lead poisoning prevention strategy that will help us identify children who have been exposed and intervene. And that's all a reflection of the way these scores are trending. But there is a flip side to this. And the bad news of the hide part of our scenario is that we are still seeing influence of special interest within the legislature, whether that's oil and gas industry or private utility industry, which continues to spend thousands of dollars on lobbying and political donations in order to influence our policymakers. And that's reflected in the fact that we also saw, while we saw an increase in environmental champions on the Jekyll side of things, we saw an increase in 0%ers as well, people who did not vote the right way on any single piece of legislation that we covered. And in the House, that rose from 90 to 95. And you'll notice there's one in the Senate, and that was Jake Corman, but that 0% is somewhat deceptive because of SB 522, which unanimously passed. Everybody but Jake Corman got at least a positive vote on that one. Senator Corman happened to have an absence that day and didn't vote on the legislation. So the 0% can be a little bit misleading. I think the other thing that's concerning when you look at the demographics and dynamics here is the increase in Democrats who have 50% or lower in terms of a score. In 2019-2020 scorecard that we did, there were 4 Democrats who had a score of 50% or lower, and the lowest score amongst those 4 Democrats was 46%. In our current scorecard tonight, we see that increase to 6 Democrats with 50% or lower voting records, and the lowest score is 17%. And so that's very concerning. And when you factor in when you factor in 0%ers, influence of industry, Democrats who are tending to vote against the environment, what you have is stuff like Senate Bill 597 passing the state Senate. And that's legislation that was introduced by Senator Patrick Stefano from Southwestern Pennsylvania. And the bill uses the guise of upgrading water quality and water infrastructure to place unfunded mandates on authorities and utilities across the Commonwealth that could result in potentially negative impacts trickling down to ratepayers and municipalities. Specifically, the bill requires systems to make mapping and upgrades part of their annual budget and to set rates to a level that ensures they have the necessary finances to fund these projects. Without the Commonwealth taking clear steps to provide dedicated financial support for this, which they're not doing, will almost assuredly result in significant ratepayer hikes, an impact that could be compounded in low income and communities of color if systems aren't also required to establish customer assistance programs. In addition, the requirements and expenses are clearly a vehicle toward creating burdens that set up smaller and mid-sized systems for failure, making them less desirable to be run by a municipality or a publicly controlled authority, and therefore easy targets to be taken over by private systems. And we all feel it's a false perception and argument that privatization will result in improved service due to the financial resources that private utilities have. In fact, private utilities are more often focused on delivering profits to corporate shareholders and institutional investors. This has led to a history of imposing substantial rate increases following acquisitions. For example, after Aqua acquired systems in Bensalem, Bristol, and Westchester in eastern Pennsylvania, they more than doubled rates. So given the special interest pressure behind 597 and many of the other bills that my colleagues will be talking about tonight, and that are also outlined in our scorecard, our monitoring really and vigilance can't end here tonight with the release of the scorecard. We got to continue to do this through the fall as well. So thank you again for joining us tonight, and I'll kick it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Steve. Wow, those are some very interesting statistics, and I really look forward to looking at those deeply in the new scorecard. Next up, we have Robert Ruth. He's the Public Policy and Regulatory Counsel for Clean Air Action Fund. And just a reminder, you can put any questions that you have in the Q&A. Take it away, Robert.
Great. Thanks, Michelle, and good evening, everyone. As she said, I'm Robert Ruth, an attorney here on behalf of Clean Air Action Fund. And I'm with you to talk about a group of bills the coalition scored this session that all feature a common theme: deregulation in service of the fossil fuel industry and at the expense of our climate and environment. In different ways, these bills each try to strip away tools from our environmental regulatory agency, DEP, eroding executive branch powers and increasing threats to public health. As many of you may know, DEP's fundamental mission is to protect Pennsylvania's air, land, and water from pollution and to provide for the health and safety of its residents through a cleaner environment. They enact pollution control requirements via regulations. They review permit applications. They are legally authorized to perform oversight and enforcement on corporate polluters. The agency is far from perfect. Groups like mine and others often take them to court. But it must be acknowledged that DEP has for years been deliberately underfunded and understaffed by our state legislature. But unfortunately for too many, that's still not enough. Which brings me to these bills. Now, some of these you could refer to as perennials. They have been introduced and reintroduced each session, stretching back many years at this point. It doesn't make their intended consequences any less radical, though. You can see some of the Senate versions listed on the screen here. There are also House companions to these. I won't spend too much time getting into the details, as these have mostly just crossed chambers, meaning the House has voted to move its package of bills over to the Senate and vice versa. They're sitting in committee and they won't become law while Governor Wolf is in office. They have been marketed both this session and in the past as attempts to streamline our government, making it more efficient and effective, but in fact, they would do the opposite in adding extraneous and new layers of bureaucracy in some cases. One of these bills would outsource DEP's permitting authority to private third parties with zero conflict of interest provisions included. A program like that was actually tried under Governor Corbett. It failed miserably, and it was quietly shelved. Another of these would require agencies to repeal 2 existing regulations every time they intend to promulgate a new one. That's a particularly arbitrary and childish way to approach governing. There's no consideration given to the relative scope and benefits of the regulations at issue. The bill I'm describing would also create a new so-called independent office of the repealer. It would be governed by a politically appointed committee, so you know that it's truly independent. Another one of these would require every agency regulation to be affirmatively approved by the legislature before enactment, with no requirement that a proposed regulation, which under the current law takes or can take over 2 years to work through the process, that any proposed reg that gets presented to the legislature is ever brought up for a vote. The General Assembly could just sit on its hands and pocket veto anything it wants. Now, so there are several of these, but I really want to focus on 3 newer bills that are all driven by animosity to one regulation in particular, the most significant and consequential climate policy, arguably in Pennsylvania history. It would establish what's technically known as the CO2 budget trading program. It's an air regulation designed to reduce carbon pollution from electric generating units, or in other words, power plants. And it enables Pennsylvania participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, most commonly known as RGGI. This program is projected to cut up to 227 million tons of carbon pollution from Pennsylvania power plants by 2030, save billions of dollars in avoided healthcare costs. And it will provide hundreds of millions of dollars in fees annually that can be reinvested to further eliminate air pollution and benefit our communities. Now, needless to say, it has been the subject of relentless ideological and political attacks and repeated votes in the legislature to block it this session. The most serious threat to RGGI itself came from Senate Concurrent Regulatory Review Resolution, or SCRRR1. It's a concurrent resolution that's authorized by an existing law, the State's Regulatory Review Act. So toward the very end of the regulatory process, after a regulation has been approved by various advisory committees, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, the Attorney General's Office, and other entities, the legislature is afforded time to cobble together a veto-proof majority to block a regulation. I should mention there's actually litigation ongoing to determine just how long the Reg Review Act does allow the General Assembly to block a reg when it's otherwise at the finish line. So SCRRR1 was a straightforward up or down vote to block RGGI. It passed the Senate, it passed the House, it was swiftly vetoed by Governor Wolf the same day it reached his desk, and then the Senate tried and failed to override the veto in April. They fell just one vote short. The regulation was published a few weeks later in the PA Bulletin, and it became the law of the land. It is now tied up in multiple court challenges, and we could spend a lot of time on that, but I want to push on to talk about two other bills targeted at RGGI that were introduced early in 2021, each of which would have had even more sweeping consequences than just blocking RGGI. The Senate version, SB 119, which was sponsored by Senator Pittman of Indiana County, would completely strip DEP of its authority to limit carbon pollution in any form whatsoever. The House version, HB 637, sponsored by Representative Struzzi, also of Indiana County, would do the same, but would also have retroactive application, meaning any existing DEP policy to control CO2 pollution would be abrogated. That bill was actually, the House bill, was amended earlier this year to provide for a one-time allocation of $250 million in COVID relief money to spend on infrastructure projects and a few other things. That was an attempt to siphon off some no votes. But compare that to the alternative, RGGI participation could result in Pennsylvania receiving nearly that amount in funds every single quarter. So 4 times a year moving forward indefinitely. So HB 637 did pass the House in March. It now sits in the Senate ERE, or Environmental Resources and Energy Committee, while SB 119 passed the Senate in June of 2021, and it now sits ready for a final vote in the House if leadership ever wants to run it this fall. So those have been the real centerpieces of the deregulation effort this session, along with the usual suspects that I mentioned first. There's even more on this front, the deregulation front, contained in SB 106, but I will let Katie get into that. So I will send it back to Michelle for now. Thanks all, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Robert. Some of you may not realize this, but Robert just broke down many years of law school in like 7 minutes in a beautiful way. So thank you so much for that, Robert. And now we're going to turn to Katie Bloom, the Political and Legislative Director for Conservation Voters of PA. To you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. I do want to just reiterate what Robert did. He is always a wonderful person to break down what can be very, very confusing regulations and anti-regulatory legislation. And I greatly appreciate that. And Steve's breakdown and Jen's breakdown. I love working with these folks on this scorecard. And it is an effort. So I just kind of want to wrap up a little bit and say, hey, you can totally check out our scorecard. We're going to drop a link in the chat here, and this will be coming up on all of our organizational websites. We'll be having the PDF of the scorecard there soon. But one thing that is going to be happening that we really want people to pay attention to and really get to know about what is happening is a bill that we scored called SB 106. And that is what is a constitutional amendment bill. And I really hope that all of our participants this evening know how a constitutional amendment process works in Pennsylvania, but I'm going to err on the side of caution and say maybe not. So what happens is in 2 consecutive legislative sessions, the General Assembly must pass through both chambers the exact same bill. So they could pass a bill in the upcoming session days in September. It passes through both chambers, and then they can pass it again, say in February, because that is another legislative session day or session year. And what happens with constitutional amendment bills is the governor cannot veto these bills. So they are incredibly dangerous when you have legislators that don't like Governor Wolf's veto pen and they want to move forward to override him as much as possible to do detrimental things to our environment. And SB 106 actually contained 5 separate constitutional amendments. Now, there have been some court cases filed about all of this. I don't want to get into some legislative and legal weeds about it. We're hoping those court cases might be successful. But those 5 amendments, one you saw all over the news, one was about a right to abortion. But as an environmental community, there were others that we were concerned about. And also the other one was the right of voters to, the right of the governor to pick their lieutenant governor candidate and not have the lieutenant governor on the ballot. Those were 2 of them. The other 3 were 2 related to democracy and 1 related to regulatory authority. They're really upset that they can't get these bills passed. They can't override a governor's veto on some of the bills that you just heard Robert talk about. So they want to push them through via a constitutional amendment. So we are watching all of this very closely. If folks were paying attention into early July during the budget moments, you know that those were passed sort of, midnight surprises that people were not necessarily aware of. And it's a really big problem. We care about these democracy amendments in this legislation because we know that well over 70% of Pennsylvania's population, and that's a pretty regular number coming back, it believes that we need to combat climate change. And if that's not happening, and we have definitely a majority of people knowing and believing that we have to do something about climate change, but our elected officials still aren't doing anything about it, that's a problem. So we need to care about democracy as well as the legislature trying to block regulations. So this is a little taste of what we're looking ahead towards. We're looking ahead towards some good things. We had a really good budget with some substantial conservation investments, about $750 million there. But we're also seeing the fossil fuel industry start coming around and wanting to possibly put in some new technologies that aren't necessarily proven, very expensive, and provide new markets for natural gas, which is a fossil fuel that we really need to start moving away from if we want to continue to work towards meeting our climate goals. And we will be seeing this. We're going to wait and see what happens throughout the fall. And I'm also going to give a little plug here. But there's also some policy ideas that we have within this group and with well over 30 other environmental partners and justice partners across the state. Is a shared vision for Pennsylvania's environment and communities. And that's something we're going to be looking forward going ahead with. And we're going to be speaking to legislators this fall and early next year about some of the policy ideas in there. So maybe we can stop seeing all of this red on the scorecard that you will see. We dropped the link in the chat, and maybe we'll start seeing some more green. Michelle?
Thank you, Katie. Thank you to all of our speakers. You guys really broke down and introduced our scorecard so well. So now I know you all have some burning questions, so we're going to get to answering those right now. And I invite all of our panelists to answer the questions. And if you have one and you haven't had a chance, you can still put it into the Q&A right now. But to get started, we have a question, and it's, how can your consortium help to promote legislators running for office who are environmental champions?
I'll take that. We work, I know that multiple organizations across Pennsylvania's advocacy space work with an organization called Lead PA to help recruit candidates, train candidates, and things like that. And myself and other partners have helped educate people on what the pressing issues are in Pennsylvania. And also, do you know a candidate? Do you know a legislator? Are you going to share this PDF with your friend who might be running for state house or your legislator who's running for re-election? So we're relying on all of you as well. And please keep your eyes peeled over the next several days into next week. We're going to start releasing some wonderful social media graphics just to help keep promoting this wide and far throughout Pennsylvania.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. And we have another question. How do you suggest that this information get out to the public versus the information that the fossil fuel industry generates? Do I have any takers on the panel? Is it Katie again? Oh, Jen?
Sure, I can sort of address that. So okay, can you hear me now? I think I'm unmuted. There are a lot of things that we're doing to publicize this information. As Katie and Michelle said, there'll be a social media push. There's a press release coming. I think all the groups here will house it on our websites. We will probably send announcement emails to our memberships, letting them know about this. And I would suggest for everyone who is attending tonight, and when you have this link, when you see it on our website, share that on your social media pages, share that with people you know. It's fairly easy right now to spread the word. We don't quite have the budgets that the fossil fuel industry has, but you can do tremendous things with like word of mouth and social media at this point. And again, we are doing some coordinated media on this also. I don't know if Michelle, you have anything to add, or Katie.
I think you said that really well, Jen. Yeah, everyone who's attending is going to get an email back with this recording, so you can watch it again. You can share with your friends. And from Conservation Voters, you'll be receiving an email with the link for our scorecard, as well as some social media graphics that you can share. So it's really exciting. Like Jen said, we may not have the money from fossil fuel power, but we have people power, and I'm ready to use it. Okay, and the next question was, how did 2644 become law if the governor didn't sign it? Great question. Who wants to take that one?
I can answer that one since that was the bill I covered. So in Pennsylvania, the governor can either sign a bill or veto a bill. If he doesn't do that within 10 days, it automatically becomes law. So that's sort of called lapsing into law through inaction. And I think there was a follow-up question to this where it was like, why would he do this? And it was actually part of budget negotiations. It wasn't part of the actual budget documents, but we were told that it was part of budget negotiations. So that's why this bill, this really terrible bill, was allowed to become law.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. All right, we have another question, and it is, how does the gas industry influence legislators besides campaign contributions?
Happy to take this one. One of my favorite statistics, although I haven't checked it in a little while, is you are on this panel looking at 4 of about 8 to 12 full-time environmental lobbyists in Pennsylvania. That's probably about the full-time side. The Marcellus Shale Coalition has an equivalent infrastructure behind them to have that kind of full-time equivalent for every single legislator in the legislature. And one thing that happened when fracking started in Pennsylvania was that coalition really started to get contracts with all of the major lobby firms and a lot of legal firms and groups like that. And it's kind of grown with the fossil fuel industry all together as a whole in Pennsylvania, so that when we want to hire a really good consultant, sometimes those consultants are actually conflicted out. So we have an uphill battle, but even though I sound kind of doom and gloomy, it is really the people power that has been pushing all of this. And one thing I just want to highlight extra, you heard Robert talk about how they couldn't override a governor's veto by 1 vote. And that is because of all of you. I know CVPA and Penn Future, we have a joint kind of Reggie Defenders team. And I know all of these other organizations have put things out to kind of mobilize people on the ground and mobilize constituents to make sure that we keep protecting our environment, because they might have fossil fuel CEO millions, but we have all of you.
And one quick addition, just to build on what Katie laid out there. Not only do they have lobbyists who are just in touch with legislative offices regularly, I mean, they write bills for them. Like you heard Jen mention SB 275, that's pushed by a trade association that was shopping legislation like that in state houses across the country. They draft the bills they want to see become law and spoon feed it to offices. So just a further effort in the same vein as Katie was talking about with lobbying. That's a way they influence our legislators aside from just the campaign contributions.
Thank you, Robert and Katie. Next question we had from a familiar face to CVPA and Penn Future. Was there any legislator or legislators that surprised you with their score? Name names.
Actually, no, I wasn't surprised. But keep in mind, we're the folks who are in this all of the time, right? We're the ones having conversations with legislators. I think there were opportunities for people to do better than they did. I am actually pretty impressed with a growing number of the majority party starting to get some higher scores. The problem is there's a lot more of their colleagues that are hitting that full-on 0%. But there are a handful that are starting to step up and really do some good things. And I think some of that is also influencing some of maybe the more moderate folks in the minority party. But none of it was overly surprising. I think, to any of us. I'm not sure if anyone else was surprised, but one statistic, and I know Steve laid out some demographics earlier, and I just want to highlight, although we have, for example, like if you look at the total of both chambers, the average Republican is 5.6%, and the average Democrat is 91.7 out of the entire legislature. But I want to point out that in Eastern Pennsylvania versus Western Pennsylvania, there is a big difference. So we have work to do across the state. So no, based on those percentages, not super surprised. We know that Western Pennsylvania is much more the extractive part of the state, and we just need to continue to do education and work there.
I'm gonna jump in because I mean I think you're right on what you said, Katie, for us, but I'm also a little surprised and disheartened, quite frankly. I think some of our folks on our call who might not be into the daily weeds as we are would be surprised to hear that there are the Democrats, especially within the House, aren't aligning much more strongly with the environment. And we've got people like Frank Burns, Chris Sonato, whose scores that were moderate in years past have gotten worse. And from my perspective, like depending on how things go in the future here, you know, our next legislative session, we're going to need more Democrats to step up and become environmental champions. We've got too much riding with climate change and other things for people to not just be less than 100%, but for Democrats especially to be voting in the like 30s and 20s, like that's just not acceptable. And I think there's a lot of people out there would be shocked to see just how low some of the Democratic scores are, especially on the House side of things. And we need to utilize some of the stuff that we've all talked about here with applying pressure to those legislators to make sure that if they're still there come next session, that they're boosting up those scores. And when important environmental legislation is coming up and important legislation around our democracy and our voting rights, that they're making the right choices here.
Thank you. All right, we have another question. With redistricting in the new districts, there are more retirements than usual and more open seats than usual. So how can we explore the positions of legislators in these open seats?
That is going to be hard. I will say that if you have retirements, we have really a lot of retirements, folks who lost primaries, people who are retiring across the state along with new districts. So first of all, if you have an incumbent, even if you're in a new district and you have someone who's already been serving in the legislature, their score as is in their current district is available there on the PDF. I will add that I highly recommend doing candidate research. All of our organizations participate in some level of endorsement process, which means that this actual scorecard coalition is also the Pennsylvania Environmental Legislative Questionnaire Coalition too, where we kind of combine priorities from all of us. And we have had a whole pile submitted, and our organizations do endorsements, and I would pay attention to who has been endorsed. I would pay attention to candidate websites and go from there. If it is a brand new district with brand new candidates, because we can't say they're absolutely going to do this until they're actually there. But by doing things like filling out a questionnaire, that actually then gives us the opportunity to say, hey, you put this in your questionnaire. Why aren't you voting the way we need you to vote?
I mean, I'll add too that like the scorecard here can be a sort of citizen questionnaire for candidates out there. And so you have a tool here at your disposal to potentially ask candidates running in your district for state house or state senate, where would you have stood on this issue? Here's a bill that maybe is passed, where would you have been on it? Or in some of the bills that I highlighted earlier that just passed the state Senate, they may or may not come up in the House during the fall session, which is abbreviated. So I think it's fair to say, if this momentum happens again, where would you be on protecting our children from lead? Where would you be on a piece of legislation that would potentially lead to privatization of water utilities? And so I would encourage participants to utilize this as sort of their own questionnaire and challenge their own candidates within their district, especially in these open seats of where they would be on these issues should they have been in office at this time, or should they get a chance to vote on some of these things that might not have completely passed both chambers.
Awesome, thanks. I believe this question might have been spurred from when Steve was presenting, actually. It is, why are those Democrats not aligned and what has changed?
I mean, I think that's a good question, and probably one that needs a little bit more research into where political contributions might be coming, what sort of influences there might be within their particular district. Maybe it's oil and gas, maybe it's something else. But again, I think these are all things that the scorecard gives us a tool to utilize to challenge these folks about why their environmental score is not where it should be, and how their score being so poor is in some ways preventing Pennsylvania from moving forward to tackle serious environmental issues that it has before it.
Great, thank you. We had a question about, when did public utilities start to fall into private hands? For instance, the water privatization bill that, Steve, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but you did talk about it.
I'm happy to keep the ball rolling here, give people other chance to rest their voice. I mean, so we've seen now in the past couple of legislative sessions, there really be an effort by private utilities or private companies to pass legislation that's making it easier for them to take over these water utilities, and that this SB 597 is just a new extension of some of the previous things that took place in past legislatures to do this. And again, I mean, this is in some ways corporate greed and wanting to build out your portfolio and wanting to get more money coming into your company in order to do this. And I mean, the reality is that in Pennsylvania, we've got a lot of old and aging infrastructure, and it really does need to be updated. But the way to go about updating it is not by creating situations that allow for privatization and corporate greed to take over, but for money to be invested from our state into helping support local water utilities achieve clean water through replacement of lead service lines. Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority in southwestern Pennsylvania has utilized Penvest funds in order to help make that happen. Now, not every utility, and there are a lot of them across Pennsylvania, are aware of the opportunities, know how to navigate the systems because they're small or mid-sized. There's also a lot of, quite honestly, municipalities that are financially distressed across our Commonwealth, and some of them run their water authorities as well. And so again, these private companies are being predatory in terms of what they're doing, and sort of like what Robert was talking about with the oil and gas company, they're utilizing their financial resources to create campaign contributions to get legislators on their side. They're utilizing their bigger lobbying arm, similar to the way Katie was talking about the oil and gas industry. And they're also, as Robert was talking about, utilizing these lobbying folks to help write legislation that is advantageous to them. I know oil and gas companies get the sort of spotlight in Pennsylvania, and in many cases rightfully so, but there's plenty of other entities similar to them that are out there that are utilizing similar tactics to get what they want. And this is really sort of the first time that a light is being shined on this particular issue, and one that we've got to make sure continues to stay bright on it so that we can prevent privatizations and keep authorities in public control where we as ratepayers have a say in what happens.
Thank you. So many great questions. Another question we got was, there are still Democrats aligning with pipe fitters rather than the environment. Why can't they replace lead pipes rather than build gas pipelines?
So one thing that is a product of the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and the newly passed Inflation Reduction Act is a great combination of making really, really, really solid infrastructure investments at the federal level. We hope to see some things in the future also at the state level. And Steve said it, we have communities that are distressed. And predominantly when there's municipal work happening, saying changing out water lines, a lot of that is what we call prevailing wage work and can be unionized and is typically unionized labor, which we do want to see because we do want laborers to be treated fairly and equitably and everyone to have access to the jobs. So we hope to see some really neat investments coming in. We hope to see some stuff flowing with well capping funds and some of these other programs that have started kicking off. We are, of course, waiting for some federal guidance, and it's a great place to have a blue-green kind of partnership. We're seeing this with electric vehicle infrastructure build out already. So that is exciting to see, and hopefully some of this tide is turning. Making another plug for a shared vision, there's an entire section on labor and the environment. So we hope you'll check that out too, as well as our scorecard, but look at the scorecard first.
Well, while we have you unmuted, Katie, I see a CVPA specific question. There are the CVPA 2022 endorsements that are coming out. Are these still open for more endorsements, and how?
Yes and no. There are more endorsements being released that are not on our website yet, but we are actually closed. CVPA does not want to endorse too close to an election because we do want candidates to promote those endorsements. So there will be some more coming publicly very, very, very soon if you have not found a candidate you like on there.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for all of your great questions. I know that we haven't heard from Katie enough, so I'm actually going to throw it back to her and she is going to give you some asks.
Yes, I have 2 asks. The news that I have for the asks, we have said it many, many, many times over, is what can we do to push this out? So we want you, as you see our organization start putting out graphics on social media to kind of keep this conversation going over the next couple of days, share them. Let's use this grassroots advocacy to let people know how their legislators voted. We definitely want you to check out the scorecard online, which is that online PDF that we dropped for you. We're going to do some other things down the road here pretty soon with other online tools. And we just want you, the other ask is share that scorecard. If you are a friend with a candidate, or you are friends with John Doe, who's running for State House, and you have coffee with his wife, Jane Doe, every morning, please say, hey, you need to go check out this scorecard to see how you can your husband can do better when he's in office or something. So just please get out this scorecard, help us educate everybody across Pennsylvania. And that is the biggest ask we have for all of you. And please pay attention to your email in the coming days and week as we send further updates to everyone, as well as this recording. And we were not able to get to all of the questions, but you will be getting a follow-up email also with some of those other items answered as needed. So thank you all so very much. And have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.